In this mini lecture, we're going to take a look at listening. This is something that we do more often than even speaking, and something that many of us are not very good at. Now, Stephen Covey, who is the author of The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, said most people do not listen with the intent to understand, they listen with the intent to reply. Think about that. How many times have you been in a situation and someone is talking to you and you don't even necessarily hear all the words that they say? You're thinking about how you can reply to them or how to get your point across. When that happens, it's an example of poor listening. So before we get into improving our listening skills, let's just take a look at the difference between hearing and listening. Hearing is a physiological process. It involves the vibration of sound waves on the eardrum and the firing of electrochemical impulses from the inner ear to the brain. Perhaps someone is talking to you and you don't respond and they say something back and they said, "Did you hear me?" Well, you may have heard, your eardrum might have been vibrating, but perhaps those sounds didn't quite make it to your brain. And your brain is where listening happens. Listening is a mental process. It involves paying close attention to and making sense of what is heard. So we may hear something, but we may not really be listening. We may not really be attending. So in order to listen, the first thing we need to do is to select what sounds we're going to hear. Have you ever been sitting in a room and there's a clock ticking and you never even realized there was a clock in the room until it was very quiet? And you hear that tick-tock of the clock. At that point, you are selecting to listen to that. Attending is focusing on the chosen sounds. You're going to kind of block out the other things that are happening and just attend to that sound or that interaction that's happening. Now, understanding is where you assign meaning to the sounds you select. Let's say that you're having a conversation with someone and there are words that they are using that you don't quite understand. That would interfere with your ability to assign meanings to the sounds and the message that they're sending. Remembering is the process of recalling the information. Can you remember what somebody said? And finally, responding is when you let people know you have received and you have understood their message. Now, on a daily basis, we engage in different types of listening. First type is appreciative listening. This is where you're just listening for pleasure or enjoyment. You're listening to some music, you are listening to a comedy routine, you're watching a movie, where you're just kind of laid back and not trying to pay attention to the message too intently and just kind of relaxing. Now, empathic listening, this is what you might do with a friend. You're listening to provide emotional support. This could be a friend. People who are counselors or clergy need to have very skilled empathic listening skills. Comprehensive listening is something that you do when you're sitting in a classroom. Your listening is focused on understanding the speaker's message. Can I understand what they're trying to say to me? You're sitting in a classroom, perhaps you're getting directions where to go somewhere. And the final type of listening is critical listening. This is where not only are we trying to understand the message, but we're evaluating a message whether to accept it or to reject it. You can think of a campaign speech or a sales pitch. Perhaps you're going to buy a car and you are trying to listen to what the salesperson is trying to tell you. This involves a little bit deeper mental process when we're listening critically. Now that we've identified some types of listening, let's take a look at some of the barriers, and there are many barriers to effective listening. Now, most people think of noise as an unpleasant sound. We talked about this a little bit when we were talking about verbal and nonverbal messages. Think about how difficult it is to hear your friend at a concert, or the struggle to hear when a baby is crying. These can all interfere, of course, with listening, but there are many other barriers. So let's classify these barriers to listening as external noise and internal noise. So first, let's deal with external noise. External noise is any barrier that originates outside of the listener's body. This could be some environmental noise. This is when something within the room or place where the speech is happening interrupts your ability to listen. Now, this can be noise. It can also be a situation if the room is very warm and it's very difficult then to focus. Another type of external noise is linguistic noise. This is when the verbal or the nonverbal message from the speaker is unfamiliar to or misunderstood by the listener. It might be a word the listener does not know. It might be poor organization. It could be a distracting mannerism. This would all be linguistic noise. We certainly have all had many situations where we've been talking with people and they have not understood a word we used, or they misunderstood something that we said. Oftentimes you'll see this across generations. If I'm talking with my grandmother and I use certain words, especially words with technology, she wouldn't know what I was talking about. If I said, "Oh, I'll send you a text," she might think that I was sending her a book, not a text message on a cell phone. So there could be external barriers to effective listening, but there's also internal barriers. And this internal noise is something that happens within the person. Think of physiological noise. These are bodily conditions that prevent or constrain the listening process. Maybe you didn't get enough sleep. Maybe you have a headache. Maybe you've had a really bad cold and you know in your sinuses and you can't hear and everything sounds all kind of fuzzy and foggy. You can also have psychological noise, and this is an emotional condition that prevents you from focusing on a message. Maybe you're bored, you're thinking about an upcoming test, you're angry because of a conflict with your friend. Psychological noise is a significant barrier to listening. So, as a speaker in front of a group of people, you certainly can control some of these, but you can't control all of them. So let's just take a look at what you can do to help your audience be able to listen to your message better. First, you should know your audience and adapt your message. If you are speaking to an audience where there's a wide range of backgrounds, you'll want to make sure that your message is adapted so that your audience can understand. You're using language and terms that can be readily identified. You're explaining or defining those terms if you think your audience does not know. Of course, you can create an effective message through your attention getter, your language, your organization, and your supporting material. When we structure a speech in a way that is very organized, when we help guide the audience through the speech by using transitions, when we define terms that are unknown, when we reiterate ideas that we think may be complicated, this can all help the audience to be better listeners to your speech message. Third, you can be confident. We are more likely to interpret a speaker who looks us in the eye, who uses vocal variety, who has some enthusiasm. You can certainly try to the extent that you can to control the environment. Some of these are certainly outside of your control, but as much as possible, that's something you would want to try to do. And finally, you try to listen to your audience's nonverbal messages. If the audience is looking at you and you see a few people that are looking a little confused, maybe they are putting their heads down, or maybe they just kind of have a weird expression on their face, that should be a signal to you that you need to go back and adapt your message, that something didn't quite get through. So as a speaker, those are things that you can do. But let's take a look at how you can be as a listener. One, listening actively, giving your full attention to someone, a speaker, your friend, someone when they're talking to you. Listening for main points. As you are evaluating speeches and listening to your peers, you want to try to listen to those main points, which is, of course, as a speaker, why it's important to highlight those so frequently and to use good transitions so that we know that we're moving between main points. You could certainly be a better listener by taking notes. I sometimes think this is a lost art form. When I was in school, a teacher would talk and we would take notes. And today that does not happen quite as frequently. But by taking notes when someone is speaking or delivering a message, it helps you to remember that message. And of course, as a listener, try to give feedback non-verbally, nodding your head, smiling, trying to make eye contact. So that's listening actively. You can also listen critically. So listen carefully to the information that's being presented. Also, you could consider alternatives. Suspending judgment until more details are given is going to be important, particularly when you're listening to persuasive messages. You want to try to evaluate the credibility of that information and wait until you hear everything until you make a final decision. And keeping, of course, an open mind. We've all had conversations with people where we're really not sure where they're coming from, and we need to listen to what they have to say and kind of hear them out before we make a final decision. So hopefully, considering this information will allow you to become a better listener.